I did a 90-day pause for the people that didn't retaliate because I told them if you retaliate, we're going to double it. And that's what I did with China because they did retaliate.
That was Wednesday when Donald Trump announced his 90-day pause on his sweeping tariff policy that targeted over 150 countries. This pause whiplashed the stock market for one of the biggest days ever in stock market history. Now, prior to pausing of the tariffs on Wednesday, the S&P 500 had actually closed at a 200-day low. Things were looking bleak. The S&P 500 was trading below 5,000, and JP Morgan's CEO was calling for a recession as the most likely outcome. However, after the pause, the Dow surged 3,000 points, and that was actually the third biggest gain in post-World War II history. However, there was still one country still left in Trump's tariff crosshairs, and that was none other than China. After a week of back and forth tensions and escalations between China and the United States, the current tariff rates between the two countries at the time of this recording is as follows. There is currently a 145% tariff on goods imported from China to the US, and the latest today is that China has imposed a 125% tariff on all US imported goods. More strikingly is that China has even started to cut off some services that the US imports, such as US movies. Quote, "This is the end of the escalation in terms of bilateral tariff rates. Both China and the US have sent clear messages. There is no point of raising tariffs further." And I pretty much agree with this quote here. At this point, there's no point in trading between the countries with tariff rates this high. It effectively creates a trade embargo between the US and China. So this sparks a bigger question. What's going to happen between the world's two largest economies, and what does the US actually want from China? Because while the rest of the world's reciprocal tariff rate has been lowered to 10% and also paused for 90 days, China's tariff rate has just gone higher and higher, and it's still in full effect. So in today's video, let's dive deeper into what the US-China trade war means for the economy, figure out what the US actually wants from China, and what China's hypothetical responses could be. According to the White House, China has decimated US industry in the form of lost jobs, 3.7 million according to the White House website. They also state that China's policies and practices have undermined American competitiveness, and whereby the US has become vulnerable due to its dependence on Chinese manufacturing and supply chains. The White House fact sheet positions China as a significant trade adversary due to the trade deficit, but is this true, or is it just simply a pattern of economic playing out in the real world? In 2024, the US sold China just over $143 billion worth of physical goods and bought from China $438 billion worth of goods. This creates a trade imbalance of negative $295 billion for the United States. It also means that since the US buys more Chinese goods than vice versa, that the tariff on Chinese goods is going to have more of an economic impact than the same equivalent tariff going the other way. Trump believes that China has been ripping off the US for quite some time now because of just how cheaply they are able to produce goods for the world. And according to the White House fact sheet again, quote, "Countries including China, Germany, Japan, and South Korea have pursued policies that suppress the domestic consumption power of their own citizens to artificially boost the competitiveness of their export products. Such policies include regressive tax systems, low or unenforced penalties for environmental degradation, and policies intended to suppress worker wages relative to productivity." What this means is that China is able to sell their products for super cheap in America because of China's tax system and environmental standards being way different than the United States. In addition, workers might be getting better at their jobs and making more stuff per hour, but their paychecks don't get bigger, and all that extra value goes to making exports cheaper instead of improving their own workers' lives. The result, the White House claims, is that it's much harder for American companies to compete. American workers get paid more, have stricter environmental standards, and different tax systems, so it simply just costs more to make products in America. As a result, yes, the US runs a $295 billion trade deficit with China, and this is one of the main arguments Trump has for wanting to tariff China in particular. But is a trade deficit actually a bad thing? So in my opinion, no. Trade deficits or surpluses aren't inherently good or bad. They just often reflect the natural economic patterns and comparative advantages that countries have. So if you think about your cup of coffee, did you know that America does not even have the right climate or soil in order to grow coffee efficiently? Therefore, over 99% of the coffee we drink in the US is imported, and in this case, a country like Colombia has a comparative advantage over the United States. A comparative advantage simply refers to the ability of a country, company, or individual to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than others. So it would be a huge cost to farmers in the United States to try to grow coffee, as the climate isn't suitable for coffee. So instead, we import it and stick to what we're good at. Similarly, if you're really good at guitar and your friend is really good at singing and you want to start a band, it probably makes sense for you to stick to guitar and your friend to stick to singing. It's just you guys are optimizing your strengths. Therefore, my point here is that we run deficits all the time with other people and other countries. The US runs a deficit with Colombia on coffee imports, and that's not really a problem that needs fixing. It's just plain old economics. This example should show you that trade in the context of imports and exports is more about two countries specializing and growing each other's economies through cooperation. If you've ever played Settlers of Catan, you know that trading with another player is mutually beneficial and you both get stronger when you trade. It's always that one player who never trades, they end up losing the game completely. They come in last because perhaps they just have too much sheep and they're very stubborn. In the case of China and the US, we in the US here definitely have more of an ability to consume goods manufactured around the world. We have a consumption culture, and it's not just limited to Chinese goods. And so that means the US as a whole, we have a natural demand for imports. And in the case of the United States, we actually export more services these days, such as cloud storage, computing, tuition, financial services, movies, consulting, etc. And other countries will run a deficit with us in those departments, and that's not really a bad thing. Most economists will view bilateral trade balances as a crappy metric for evaluating economic relationships. So individual country-to-country balances shouldn't really matter, but it's unfortunately what the administration wants to focus on. There are many reasons why the White House and the president are hell-bent on tariffing the world and ruffling feathers. First is the debt problem. The hopes is that the tariff revenue will help address the massive federal debt that we have, with the president claiming that these tariffs could generate significant revenue. We have $9.2 trillion of debt coming due in 2025, and I did mention this in a previous tariff video on my channel, that Trump may be purposely doing this in order to tank the markets, in order to have the Federal Reserve cut rates sooner, or have bond yields go lower in order to refinance the debt. The second reason is just flexing global economic power. The tariffs demonstrate America's leverage in the international system and create negotiating tools to extract concessions from trading partners on various issues beyond just trade. And the third is to incentivize companies to bring production back to America, rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity in critical sectors like steel, automobiles, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals that are deemed essential for, quote, national security. Here's actually what Trump said.
Jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country, and you see it happening already. We will supercharge our domestic industrial base. We will pry open foreign markets and break down foreign trade barriers. And ultimately, more production at home will mean stronger competition and lower prices for consumers. This will be indeed the golden age of America. It's coming back, and we're going to come back very strongly.
The fourth reason is that tariffing could potentially replace some domestic tax revenue, and Trump has been a proponent of trying to eliminate capital gains or income tax as of recent. So those are some of the US's reasons for having tariffs, but what does China think of all this, and what is their policy moving forward? China has taken a firm stance against the US tariffs and has made clear that they intend to retaliate with tariffs and, quote, fight till the end. The initial tariff escalation began when Trump imposed 10% tariffs on Chinese goods in February, to which China retaliated with 10 to 15% tariffs on certain products such as oil, vehicles, and coal. Then in March, another 10% tariff was slapped on China, and China retaliated with 15% tariffs on farm products such as chicken, beef, wheat, corn, and cotton. When the additional 34% tariff on China was imposed on Liberation Day, they retaliated with 34% tariffs of their own. Then as of this week, as more tariffs were poured onto China, China retaliated once again with an 84% tariff on US goods, and Thursday they retaliated with the cutting of some services such as movies.
Reciprocal. That means they do it to us and we do it to them.
What makes this particularly concerning is that both sides appear willing to accept significant economic pain to maintain their positions, turning this into a really high-stakes game of economic chicken. China seems to not be budging on this issue, and CNBC even reported that, quote, China also dropped its call for negotiations on trade in a weekend statement. Essentially, they were saying that they were done negotiating with the United States. But here's where it gets interesting. On the day of the tariff pause this week, Trump said that China wanted a deal, but they just didn't know how to do it.
China wants to make a deal. They just don't know how quite to go about it. They're proud people. And President Xi's a proud man. I know him very well. And They don't know quite how to go about it, but they'll figure it out.
So if China wants a deal ultimately, why can't they just come to an agreement as quickly as some of the other countries have? There are a few speculative reasons, in my opinion, as to perhaps why China isn't succumbing to the US's demands so easily. Number one is that China has the scale and resources to take a stand against the United States as the world's second largest economy with $17.7 trillion in GDP. China has a lot more to lose, but also more to gain with favorable trading conditions. It seems like they're angling for the long game here, and they operate completely differently when it comes to negotiating compared to a smaller economy and country like Vietnam. China is more willing to hold out for terms that align with their long-term objectives rather than just simply accepting US demands. The second reason could be a cultural belief. So the Chinese President Xi has cultivated a strong nationalist image, and backing down under American pressure could cause him to lose face among the world stage. A trade deal can't look like a loss for the Chinese, so therefore a sustainable agreement would have to allow for both sides to claim some sort of victory. I think it would have to frame concessions as mutual rather than America winning completely, and probably have to be balanced for both sides to accept. And number three, China relies more on a state-led economic policy. So when the US places a high tariff on China, and because a lot of the goods made in China are actually subsidized by the government, the US is effectively straining Chinese government resources. So think of it like this: pretend there's a Chinese solar panel company out there and they just make these amazingly efficient solar panels. That company in particular will receive a 20% Chinese government subsidy to make the price of their panels competitive across the world. Now that same company, if they were to consider importing it to the United States with super high tariffs, they probably just aren't going to do that anymore because their product is not going to be competitive in terms of price in the United States. So China's government is forced to either increase the subsidy even further or just simply accept the loss in market share in the United States as a whole. China's economic strategy relies on some of these subsidies across different industries, and therefore they can become a global leader in these emerging technologies, and that's basically how it's been working for the past 20 years or so, and it's been working really well. So tariffs are an immediate threat to that economic strategy, and that could be a reason why China is not so willing to accept any US demands or come to a trade deal as quickly as some other countries. This is the challenge that the world is facing now, and this situation seems to be ever changing and dynamic every single day. By the time you watch this video, the circumstances could change dramatically, or they could just not change at all. If you want to keep updated with what's going on in the future, just make sure to subscribe to this channel, or even check out my free newsletter called Hump Days, where I come out with 2 free new editions every single week. The link to my free newsletter, Hump Days, will be linked down right below, so make sure to check that out, and I will see you guys on a future video in this channel, and I thank you for being here. All right, peace.